coming. So happy to see so many people out for an in-person event. This year is difficult. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Sarah Wasserman. She is an associate professor of English, associate director of the Center for Material Culture at the University of Delaware. She is the author of The Death of Things, Ephemera, and the American Novel in 2020, co-author of many other things, and more forthcoming works. And I will let her talk to you about the work that she's doing now. So please join me in welcoming Sarah. Dr. Wasserman.
Sarah, it's fine. Thank you so much. So can you all hear me in the back? I don't have the mic turned on. I'm pretty loud, but if at some point with the mask it gets tricky, just someone give me a sign and I'll talk louder, turn on the mic. Thank you so much to Dr. Turner for the invitation. Thanks to Teresa Gauthier, who I doubt is here, but did so much to organize my visit. And thanks also to Dr. Emily Hyde for floating my name. As some of you may know, I went to graduate school with Dr. Hyde, so we've known each other a very long time. And I feel most sorry that she's going to hear some things that she's heard many times before. But I'm so glad to be here today. This is actually the first time, the first in-person talk I've given since before the pandemic, so it feels like a real honor and a real treat to be here with you today in this fancy building with this fancy tech support. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the first book that Dr. Turner mentioned. It came out almost exactly a year ago. It kind of thudded into the tundra of the pandemic. So I'm still thinking about that a little bit. But I'm also going to talk about where my research is going now, and a little bit about why I find material culture studies and American studies, two of the fields in which I work, so exciting. So I have a lot of ground to cover, and I want to be sure that I keep my remarks under 40 minutes. So I'm going to jump right in. So we'll start with the research on ephemera, the methods I've used, and my central arguments. And then I'll share one example from that work as a way to discuss how these ideas have led me to new projects on digital media, and then wrap up with time for us to talk together about digital culture and the afterlife of things, as promised on the lovely flyer. So although I'm an English professor who teaches literature classes, and my primary object of study is 20th and 21st century American literature, my work really sits under the umbrellas of two disciplines, American studies and material culture studies. So in my book, The Death of Things, Ephemera and the American Novel, I was trying to figure out what all the stuff, disappearing stuff, in American novels written in the second half of the 20th century could tell us not just about literature, but about America and Americans. So nothing ambitious at all here. But why, in other words, are some of our most by now canonical and cherished novels by Don DeLillo, Ralph Ellison, Marilynne Robinson, Philip Roth, Thomas Pynchon, among others, why are those novels filled with so many objects that vanish? Why would authors write at length about pop-up buildings, postage stamps, billboard apparitions, flyers, and so on? And why would we want to read about them? I'll say more about this particular type of objects. But first I want to say that I discovered in trying to answer these questions, I had to look beyond literature. I had to learn about things like consumer history, materiality, collections, archives, museums, digitalization, display practices, urban history, and particular cultural practices. To understand the meaning that we attach to objects and the meaning that their disappearance can make, I had to range at times very far afield. And this is why both American studies and material culture studies have been so important to me. So as those of you who are in Dr. Turner's class right now, who's that? Who's in Dr. Turner's class? Okay, hi. So as those of you who are in that class likely know, a revolt against the rigidity of the traditional academic disciplines of history and literature gave birth to American studies movements in the 1930s. Students and scholars wanted space to study US literature and culture. They wanted to see it taken as seriously as British literature and culture, to be able to study Melville and the American Civil War and not only Shakespeare and the monarchy. So I did a little bit of digging and I looked at what graduate classes in the English department were offered at UD in the 1960s. And UD is where Dr. Turner got her PhD. And in the 1960s, there was basically one class called Modern American Literature, and it did the American Renaissance, and that was it. And everything else was British in the English department. So to give you a sense of how different the moment we're in now is, and it really is because of these transformations in part underwrought by American studies. So that change happened, and then a basic principle of the interdisciplinary field, American Studies, that emerged is that America, a concept which includes but is not limited to the United States, is too complex to be analyzed with the tools of a single discipline. Drawing on a wide variety of intellectual traditions in the humanities and social sciences, American Studies scholars have developed methods and theories that help us understand the relationships between politics, economics, art, and literature, as well as between racial, ethnic, religious, and gender identity in America. So I remember many years ago when I said to my parents I wanted to do American Studies, my dad asked if I was going to study monster truck rallies and baseball, because that seemed to him like American cultural products, and he's not wrong, right? We can study those things from a number of different angles in American Studies, but that's not what I did, not really anyways. So now, material culture studies, which may be less familiar to many of you, is similarly interdisciplinary. It is the analysis of material culture, which is the stuff people make, use, find, throw away, cherish, and generally interact with. So it's not only the study of inanimate objects, but it's really a way of studying the relationship between people and their things. That's the culture part of material culture studies. It draws on theoretical ideas and on tangible practices from art history, archaeology, anthropology, history, preservation and conservation, archival science, and museum studies. So both American Studies and material culture studies offer us the opportunity to look at our objects of study, whether those objects are novels or TV shows or advertisements or TikToks or, I don't know, this building that we're in or the face masks that we're wearing. We look at these objects through different but intersecting lenses. So to study the depiction of objects in novels, the way that I do, right? I'm not actually looking really at the objects themselves. I'm looking at how they're written about in these novels. And to do that means approaching them several times in several registers. So that's what I do in this book. I take, for instance, a postage stamp described by Philip Roth in his novel, The Plot Against America, as one example today. In addition to thinking about what the scene in the novel means and analyzing it through close reading, I also do research on the stamp itself. So this is a stamp. This is the stamp. And if you read The Plot Against America, you know the main character is a stamp collector, and Philip Roth literally gives us pages where he's describing actual stamps from history. Because I know how much Emily loves stamps, you can pass it around. Why not? So, I try to do this research and I get my hands on the actual object if I can. I study the context of its production, how it was made, what it's worth now, how people think of it in the world of collectors, and so on. Doing this helps uncover more layers of meaning, more history that Roth brings to his novel by featuring this tiny, insignificant, seemingly insignificant, I would say, object. In this way, the excitement of working in both material culture studies and American studies comes from the ability it gives me to move between scales, from the minutia of stamps, pamphlets, and postcards to the sweep of a city or even the nation. Now, novels themselves are interesting objects. They are material artifacts, traditionally made from paper, that we often talk about, especially in classrooms, as if they're exclusively immaterial. I don't know when the last time those of you who took an English class and were reading a novel talked about the bindings and the ink of the book. Maybe it's happened, but more likely it hasn't. We talk about the immaterial dimensions of novels, the narratives, the ideas, the characters. They're portals to abstract and imaginary worlds. So lots of excellent scholarship has been done to not exactly correct this idea, but to supplement this idea, and to examine how books' materiality, whether paper and ink, or screen and keyboard, or cell phone pixels, whatever format you're reading it on, how that matters to our experience of reading. But what interested me and motivated the book is the way that the novel, in whatever form you're reading it, stores ephemera. It stores these objects marked by their imminent disappearance or destruction. So the book's title here might actually be said to be something of a misnomer, since ephemera, as they are stored within the container of the novel, are neither quite lost nor quite present, neither dead nor alive. They are instead dying, coming to us in an ongoing state of ceasing to be. As I read and kept encountering such objects in novels, I found myself wanting a theory to explain the work that disappearing objects do in fiction, their oscillation between present and absent, their ability to conjure up the mutability of our physical world and the transience of our lives. I was looking for ways to understand what I call the peculiar durée of ephemera, so their strange temporality, which is something I think those of you in Dr. Hyde's class can probably educate me about some more in the Q&A. I wanted to understand that strange durée, the fact that novels don't just depict the objects themselves, but also their vanishing and their loss. We tend to think about ephemera as trivial, like debris or trash. They aren't the grand objects, monuments, or artworks that we find in a textbook or that we think deserve our attention. But the novels that interest me use such minor objects to make it clear that the vanishing object, in fact, constitutes the enduring subject. So put more simply, the ticket stubs or brochures you've saved, actually, I feel like I should ask now, like, people still save things like that, right? You all still have, okay, good, people are still nodding. Every year, there's an increasing chance that the claims I'm making are more and more incorrect. But the ticket stubs or the brochures that you've saved or that your parents have saved, they have lots of meaning, and they play an important role in making us who we are. So in his characteristically problematic way, the thinker who really understood this, long before the novelists I study were writing, is Sigmund Freud. And I'm not going to go into depth here, but I will just point out that an essay by Freud from 1915 called On Transience helps explain why our relationship to things that vanish is just as important to who we are as our relationship to things that endure. So in the essay, Freud gives us this sort of funny definition of what he calls transience value. And he says, transience value is scarcity value in time. Limitation in the possibility of an enjoyment raises the value of the enjoyment. This is a familiar logic, I think, to all of us. So if you think about the pop-up shop, the limited time only item, pumpkin spice before it was in stores from August to November, right? Any of these things that are sort of short time, we seem to value them more because we know it's limited in time. So according to this formulation, we should enjoy rather than lament the things that we know cannot last. This is easier said than done, of course. Freud himself struggles to take pleasure in transience. By the end of the essay, his own claims collapse under the weight of his own grief. He's talking about the losses of the First World War, and he can't even sustain this thing that he's saying we should all really do in a prescriptive way. Freud wants to claim enjoyment, but it disappears as he grasps it, like the very things he mourns. A similar duality occurs in novels about disappearing objects, though often in reverse. The short lives of consumer goods, the mutability of cityscapes, the loss and destruction of prized objects don't simply inspire grief in these fictions. They do that for sure, but they also give rise to historical awareness. Oh, I suddenly see time anew. It becomes legible in a different way. They can inspire forms of community. If you think about something like a temporary roadside shrine and people who might gather around that and how it might transform, let's say, traffic momentarily. They also give rise to practices of resistance and to new non-dominative ways of being in the world. Transience value, then, might be better thought of as the fact that a particular object can have value when it is present and when it is gone. In literature, this is made vivid through representations of ephemera, things that do not come fully into possession nor vanish entirely. An object that never seems to last or to disappear. This is, of course, also a description of the novel itself. And more broadly, to return to the point I started making earlier, it's a description of the physical book. How long have people been talking about the book's death and its disappearance, and yet it sticks around, right? And so ephemera in this sense is not just naming an object like the ticket stub. It's kind of describing a logics that a lot of objects around us seem to have. As I worked on the death of things and shared pieces of it with different audiences, a common response I heard was, isn't the internet making books ephemeral too? Plenty of excellent work has been done to illuminate the way that the physical book has always existed in many different forms. Joanna Drucker, Jessica Pressman, Leah Price, and Whitney Trattin are just a few who argue that the continuity between the printed text and its newer iterations supports the argument that digitization will not kill the book, but allow it instead to multiply and proliferate. So So if you have parents or grandparents who are chastising you for reading on your cell phone, or professors, this is the argument where you say, people have always read in different forms, and people thought the printed book was going to destroy this other codex, and then people thought that the Kindle was going to destroy the book, and we're still reading, just adapt, right? I'm not sure I totally believe that, but I'll arm you with that argument anyways. So with all of that in mind, it strikes me that the question is less whether the book is dying, and more whether or not ephemera themselves are dying, thanks to increasing storage capacity and decreasing storage costs. Beyond medium-specific questions about the future of the book, the internet seems poised to preserve all ephemera long past their natural lives. If you've ever had someone screenshot a Snapchat, or you've struggled to delete a post of yours online, you know what I'm talking about. In this era of expanding hard drives, a tweet archive held by the Library of Congress, and the proliferation of cloud computing, it seems as though loss itself might become obsolete. The novels I studied convey a central lesson of ephemerality, that fictions of preservation have long underwritten our ideas of loss. In other words, loss as an entire concept depends on the desire to save things, on the desire for things to endure. The technologies and tools we create for preserving things arise out of this sense or fear of loss, and then shape our understanding of what loss is. This is an idea that we call a dialectic, that remains hidden but feels painfully obvious the minute it's uncovered. Of course, we invent new ways to save things because we don't want to lose them. But there's that third step that interests me, right? What happens then to the idea of loss that's generated the creation of the thing once you have the thing to save it, right? It's this kind of cyclical process. The fantasy of prosthetic memory and infinite storage are an intimate counterpart to the confrontations of loss we experience in everyday life. And it's thinking through that tension that in part has led me to my current projects about digital media. And this is all very abstract, but I think it's going to make sense once we look at an example. But before we do, just a couple more words about literature. If you're reading contemporary fiction, then you know that the internet has begun to appear more frequently as the subject of contemporary novels. From Gary Steingart's super sad true love story, to Chimamanda Adichie's Americana, Sally Rooney's Beautiful World, Where Are You?, Patricia Lockwood's No One Is Talking About This, and Lauren Euler's Fake Accounts, we have more novels, more movies, more texts that attend to the internet's twin dynamics of loss and preservation. This carries straight into one book I'm working on now, called Digital Intimacies, which attempts to chart the effects of digitality on our ideas of love, sex, and romance as they're represented in contemporary US fiction. The logics of ephemerality that I sort of tried to figure out in the last project are helping me to understand that even as concepts and practices of intimacy are undergoing radical transformations due to the innovation of the digital age, analog ideas of intimacy always persist, just sometimes in unlikely forms. So simulation becomes stimulation, for example, and fantasy and projection are always an important part of love stories, even when they're happening online. I'm hoping that in this book, I can make some sense of the current climate in which the internet seems to be reshaping intimacy by turning to fiction that exposes the long-standing relation between forms of desire and forms of communication. I mean, the novel itself is a form of communication, right? So if you've ever read a novel that has a marriage, for instance, as a central piece of its plot, you're already there in the kind of tension that interests me. There's a methodological goal to that project, too. My sense is that for those of us who study literature, we've really become enamored with media studies, and I'm interested in exploring all the ways that media studies can and should be influenced by literary studies, sort of reversing the current. But to talk about my other related but less conventionally scholarly project, which is also in this vein of digital and media studies, I'd like to share an example that I discuss at the very end of The Death of Things. It's a fun example, and it's a good example for all you modernists, I hope, and actually for any of you who took a high school English class, I think. But it's an example that really forms a bridge from my interest in ephemera to my interest in the digital. So many digitization projects, which have of course accelerated in the past year when we couldn't go into libraries or physical archives or special collections or museums. So many of these projects reveal the hope that technology will bring our objects of study into clearer focus. I think they can. It's nice, right, when you sit in your own home and you can click into a library's archive and rotate and manipulate an object up close and see it there on your screen. But I'm also interested in how these digitization projects preserve the familiar ache of disconnection and disappearance that novels remind us exist in ephemera. So the example I want to share with you now shows that digital forms don't just remediate objects like novels, but can instead translate the concerns of those objects. So in January 2011, a website appeared featuring an 8-bit video game adaptation of The Great Gatsby. So who's read The Great Gatsby? This is why it's such a good book to talk about. Everyone's read it. Everyone has an opinion. Okay, so in January 2011, this website appears, and the site claims that this 2D Nintendo game is an unreleased Japanese creation called Doki Doki Toshokan Gatsby no Monogatari. Apologies for my pronunciation. Okay, and the two men who have created the website found the game for 50 cents at a garage sale. So the website includes images of the game cartridge and the user's manual, that's what you're looking at here, which dates the game to 1989 or 1990. So in the game, you play as Nick Carraway, and you cross New York from the Valley of Ashes to West Egg to fight off the baddies, who are flappers, gangsters, hobos, and waiters. You fling your hat at the target, that's your weapon. The game lifts text directly from the novel. It asks you to battle drunken Tom Buchanan and also the laser shooting eyes of Dr. Eckelberg. So I'm gonna play some of this for you, and I hope you're gonna be able to hear the sound, which will come on in just a second. So here we go. You have 3 Nick Carraways to start. So that's text directly from the novel. Okay. I always feel like it might be a better use of our time if I just played that for 40 minutes, but I won't. Inevitably, someone always asks me if I show this video if that's me playing, and it's not. And if it was, we would be here for 40 minutes just watching me try to get through the first screen. I'm not a very good gamer. Okay. So it's really funny, right? You know, you play this and everyone laughs. And one reason that it's so funny and so charming is because there's a real dissonance, I think, that comes from seeing a literary classic translated into this very popular but very dated format. Although The Great Gatsby is often said to be a timeless story, it's deeply marked by its time. So watching the great jazz-era novel pressed into pixels and set to the beeping tones of a Nintendo soundtrack is intensely anachronistic. As much as this object is doubly retro, insofar as it revives the 1920s of Fitzgerald's novel and the 1980s, or early 90s of early Nintendo, gaming is also always about the present, about how we maneuver through obstacles and anticipate which scenes the next level will adapt. I think we experience that, right? When you're waiting for the music to stop and the person to press start. We're really in a suspended present while also experiencing this doubly retro object. Okay, so big reveal. When we learn that this game is not at all a found object from the past, but an idea conceived and coded by 2 programmers in Philadelphia, we find ourselves in a story that repeats the novel's own questions about shrouded origins and the waning of authenticity. The novel's preoccupation with failed adaptation, forgery, and simulacra is captured by the game's discovery myth. Oops. Even the Japanese title refers to digital mimicry and to one of the novel's central symbols of fakery. Doki doki is an onomatopoetic word often associated with comics and video games for heartbeat. And Toshokan means library, so a library of fake heartbeats. What could be more Gatsby-like? Monogatari means story. So initially, the game seemed like proof that something lost, a game from the 80s, could be resurrected. But when the truth comes out, we see a double longing for the past, a sense that, for better or for worse, Gatsby's era and the naive technology of the late 1980s might not be lost to us. The hoax also illuminates the possibility that the internet could eliminate the need for the original authentic artifact. If everything can be made and preserved on the web or in the cloud, why would we need the real thing? Do we really need the actual Nintendo and the cartridge if we have this? And would we know the original anymore if we saw it? So this is where the game leaves us. Online, navigating the green light jump, asking the same questions that motivate Fitzgerald's novel in the first place. Now, I don't want to sound as if I'm saying that everything is always the same and new media forms simply reproduce old concerns. When the truth about the Gatsby game is revealed, I think it gently mocks our nostalgia and our faith in the internet as a redemptive repository of all things vanished. It's worth remembering, too, that we seem to live through periodic Gatsby moments. The game, taken together with the 2013 Baz Luhrmann film, that's the one with Leonardo DiCaprio, that was one Gatsby moment. It's not hard to see why the story of lavish spending and fabricated fortunes leading up to financial collapse felt relevant in the wake of the Great Recession of 2007 and 8. That the game evokes the late 1980s and the early 1990s, the years of Reaganite deregulation and Wall Street booms, is yet another marker of Gatsby's relevance to the 2000 teens. You'll remember, too, the Robert Redford and Mia Farrow film version from 1974. Well, some of you will remember. Some of you might know. that film from 1974 was released in the aftermath of the 1973 oil crisis and during Nixon's resignation. And now we're right on the cusp of another Gatsby moment. A new Norton edition of the novel is about to come out, along with at least 2 others, because the novel has finally entered public domain. So I don't know what that means. It's something we can think about together. If you have thoughts about what a new contemporary Gatsby moment means, I'd love to hear them. So of course, those novels, those editions have been in works for years as they knew the copyright was going to expire. But it's hard not to see the timing as poetic. The new Gatsby arriving when both our longing for and abhorrence of parties is at an all-time high. And we shake our heads in enraged disbelief at the profit margins of Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. The Gatsby game confirms that even when objects transition from the analog to the digital, they can elicit the same sort of competing desires and layered temporalities as they do in their original form. This is a lesson I'm exploring in Digital Intimacies, where the internet is novelized and intimacy is digitized. But the Gatsby game also turned me on to the seductive unruliness, the wackiness, really, of the computing era in which I grew up, which is the 1980s. So this is sort of my last bit here, and I just want to say that I've begun initial work on a short trade book that examines pop cultural representations from the 80s, so movies, songs, commercials, TV shows, of what people imagined computers would do to romantic relations. They thought a lot of things were going to happen, and they were almost all wrong. We can talk more about that. But it was while doing the research for Digital Intimacies and finishing up an essay about the undead 80s in some recent novels that the idea for this short book took shape. The book is called Computer Love, and it's less a scholarly argument than a look at the ways we imagine computers would change our love lives in the decade when home computing became widespread. Not coincidentally, when users could touch and stroke the keys of a glowing console in the intimacy of their own home. With both Digital Intimacies and Computer Love, I'm committed to intervening in what has traditionally been a very male field. You probably won't be surprised to hear that it's mostly men that talk about computers, although that's changing. Computational history stands to be invigorated by feminist thought and by queer theory. Recent work by many different people, Alison Adam, Catherine D'Ignazio, Lauren Klein, they've begun that project, and people like Ruha Benjamin, Lisa Nakamura, and Sophia Noble have also shown how crucial it is to expose the racism of digital technology and to decenter the whiteness of digital discourse. The very concept of computer love as it existed in the 80s is in many ways a white cultural form, a ludic technologic imaginary divorced from the racial and socioeconomic disparities of the 80s. In movies like War Games, Weird Science, and Electric Dreams, I don't know how many of you have seen any of those. They're very strange to watch now, especially Electric Dreams. But we're often in those movies presented as zany, kind of utopian, even though it might be sinister in certain ways, but it's a kind of utopian pop dream about what computers might become and do. And it usually exists in a vacuum, sealed off from the decade's crack epidemic, minority targeting gentrification, broken windows policing, and mass incarceration. But computer love also exists in cultural objects, like the funk band Zapp's 1985 song, Computer Love. I'm actually going to play it a little bit in the background here, if I can. It's so fantastic. I don't think the lyrics, poetic as they are, do it justice. So this is the song from Zapp in 1985 called Computer Love. And although it's about computers and technology, it's also an expression of Black love and desire projected into a technologized future. Unlike the German band Kraftwerk's 1981 song Computerliebe, which is just German for computer love, so two songs from about the same time with the same topic and the same title. Kraftwerk's song is a kind of tinny, mechanical tune in which the singer bemoans another lonely night and says he wants a data date. But Zapp's song, although it has this synthetic synthesizer sound to it, is definitely, compared to Kraftwerk's song, much funkier, much more sensual. Computerized, Oh Baby, A Beautiful Love, sings frontman Roger Troutman through a talk box. You know me, I've been searching for someone who can share that special love with me, and your eyes have that glow. Could it be your face I see on my computer screen? He didn't know about maybe Tinder and smartphones, but he was getting pretty close here with this song. Now, I'm still in the very early days of all of this. I'm still in the very early days with all this, but it's striking that for every one instance that accurately anticipated what computing technology would do to love and romance, and Zapp's song is maybe one instance that we might say it gets kind of close to online dating apps. For every one of those instances that's kind of right, there are at least 10 instances of 80s popular culture getting it so very wrong. And one reason why I think people have responded positively to the idea of this book is because we want to understand how exactly we got to influencers and smartphones and TikTok, but not through technological history. We don't really want to understand so deeply, the chips and the processing power. We're interested in the kind of cultural history that got us here and what it means. The positive response is also, I think, in part because the 1980s are still trendy. As we crossed into the 2020s, the 90s started coming back in a big way. But the decade of perestroika and Pac-Man doesn't appear to be leaving us anytime soon. Thank Taylor Swift and her album 1989, or Stranger Things, or curse the businessman from the 80s who is no longer our president. In any case, when people hear about this book, they're often very excited to tell me about their own 80s references, their experiences playing Oregon Trail, or typing away on a Commodore 64. And they help me imagine a pixelated cover design that will appeal to our 1980s nostalgia. So even as I move away from my work on Ephemera to this project on digital culture, computation, and media history, I carry the lessons from that earlier work with me. It may sound ironic to say that the central lessons of disappearance are enduring. But of course, that's one of the central things I learned while working on Ephemera, that the things we think vanish often remain with us in a variety of ways. And the methods that I've borrowed from American studies and material culture studies remain at the heart of my idiosyncratic approach. As I turn my attention to the afterlife of things, in this case, 1980s things, computational things, things about love, intimacy, and the 40-year-old dreams we had about how they would look in the wake of new technology, I remain committed to looking for the stories in objects and for the stories between objects. So to end, I'll leave you with a final, somewhat random image, but I offer it to you in the spirit of American studies and its sort of wonderful ability to assemble and constellate different ideas, different images, different times. So I've been drawn lately to artist Clara Linden's work. In particular, I keep coming back to her 2012 sculpture, Trash Can. So this is a sculpture of a trash can, which is to say, is it also just a trash can? I'm not entirely sure. But here it is, steady and silent. It stands ready forever to receive our cast-offs. But it also greets us like a 1980s beloved icon, or at least like his stoic cousin, reminding us that visions of the future often draw upon familiar objects of the past, and also reminding us that trash, made up of the minor objects we judge as no longer worth saving, is a constant. Linden's sculpture makes a plea, I think, to consider not only the things, digital or analog, among us, but also their afterlives. Thank you.